Great. Welcome, everyone. Welcome in and welcome to Intensive Grandparenting, Negotiating the Complexities of Intergenerational Relationships, a talk with Shannon Hebblethwaite, Director of Engage and Associate Professor here at Concordia University, and a talk in celebration of International Day in Canada. The talk is being recorded and the video of the talk will be archived on the Concordia YouTube channel. We're just waiting for a few others to join us. We still have individuals in the waiting room, and we'll get started shortly. Great. Well, let's, still have individuals coming in. Okay, let's get started. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I want to start this event first by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Gingangahaka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather here today. Tiohtià:ke Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations, and today it is home to a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. Colonialism confounds chronology, and as such, we respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And although this talk is taking place on the unceded land of the Gingangahaka Nation, many of us are not, or many of you, or many of us might not be watching from Tiohtià:ke Montreal. So I'd like to invite you to reflect with us for a moment upon the lands and the histories where you find yourself today. Thank you. My name is Tristana Martin-Rubio, and I'm the coordinator of Engage Concordia Center for Research on Aging. Engage does, if you're not familiar with the center, Engage does interdisciplinary innovative work on aging, and it does so collaboratively with the community that it works with. And I'll be the moderator of this event. As some of you may know, June 1st is International Day in Canada, and we are hosting this event in celebration and recognition of that day. It is a day that recognizes and affirms the importance of developing, preserving, and honoring relationships across different generations. The importance of intergenerational bonds cannot be overstated. They can result in reducing feelings of alienation, loneliness, social isolation, as well as deeply challenging, dangerous stereotypes about what it means what it means and what it is like to be so-called young or older, among other things, of course. And these benefits of these bonds are mutual. They extend to each generation. And yet, as much as these benefits, much as there are benefits to building intergenerational tensions, these bonds can also be sites of tension between or among different generations. In today's talk, Intensive Grandparenting, Negotiating the Complexities of Intergenerational Relationships, we'll explore some of the complexities that arise in intergenerational relationships, specifically in the context of family leisure and grandparenting. The talk is based on a chapter in a book in Families, Leisure, and Social Justice, From Protest to Progress. And I'd like now to briefly introduce our speaker, Dr. Shannon Hebblethwaite. Dr. Hebblethwaite is Associate Professor of Applied Human Sciences at Concordia, as well as the Director of Engage, Concordia Center for Research on Aging. In just a few minutes, I'll pass the virtual floor to Dr. Hebblethwaite, who will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes, after which we'll open the floor to discussion and to questions. But before I do that, I just want to say a little bit about how you can participate in the conversation today. We invite and strongly encourage you to pose any questions you have, reflections, your comments or thoughts, any remarks that you may have using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions or comments as they come up for you at any point during the course of the presentation. There's no bad time to submit a question or comment. And then at the end of the talk, we'll open the floor for responding to those questions and hopefully have a generative conversation, no pun intended. We also encourage you to use social media beyond this Zoom webinar. If you're on Twitter, you can find us at engage_CU. So at ENGAGE_CU. So without further delay, please welcome Dr. Hebblethwaite to the virtual floor. Welcome.
Thanks, Tristana, and thanks to everybody for joining me today on the 11th annual Intergenerational Day nationally. There certainly is much to celebrate about intergenerational engagements, but as Tristana has so capably pointed out in the introduction already, there can also be considerable challenges and tensions in these relationships. So this is something that I've been researching since 2004. When I did the math, that added up to 17 years, how time flies. The sad part for me about that is by the time I was 17 years old, I had already lost 3 of 4 of my grandparents. But I certainly cherish those memories dearly. I think of them often in my work, as well as my own parents who've been relishing their role as grandparents over the past 12 years. So let me just start and share my screen. And we'll kind of make our way through the slides. Sorry, I kind of skipped over. This was supposed to be up when I was just saying that last little bit. So this is me, but as Tristana's pointed out, we'll be recording this and you can always view that on our YouTube channel. So today's conversation, as Tristana mentioned, is grounded in a chapter that I've recently published in a book that you see here. And Tristana's going to put the link for that to Routledge if you're interested in ordering the book. The ebook is considerably more affordable than the hard copy. But in this chapter, I explore how family leisure among generations can help to illuminate how grandparents can be disenfranchised due to the ideologies of intensive mothering and discourses of active aging. And I'm going to give you some introduction to those in just a minute. And so I look in the chapter to illuminate the ways in which this ideology of intensive mothering has become entangled with social norms around purpose of leisure, generativity, and has contributed to intergenerational tensions around intensive grandparenting. So a bit of an outline here, just a spoiler alert so that you're all very aware. I certainly don't presume that there is one answer or truth about what it means or what it looks like to be a quote unquote good grandparent. Rather, I encourage a critical reflection on the social norms and discourses around grandparenting and encourage us to think about a few things. One, how do various intersecting identities related to age, race, class, gender, and ability, among others, influence the experiences of grandparenting and the ideologies of what I'm going to talk about by the end of the presentation around intensive grandparenting? Secondly, how do we resist and or reinforce these norms of intensive grandparenting and active aging? And thirdly, how can social justice provide a lens for us to critically explore these intergenerational tensions associated with family leisure? So I'll begin today, as you can see on your outline here, by giving a little bit of a background about the intensive mothering ideology, the quote unquote good mother. Then a little bit of context about some of the dominant discourses surrounding the experiences of aging, followed by a short discussion of some of the common typologies of grandparenting that have emerged from the literature. And I'll share a number of examples of some of these normative discourses and assumptions around grandparenting, ending off with some reflection of what all of this contributes to this ideology of intensive grandparenting, or as you see here in quotes, the good grandparent. My thinking on this topic has been influenced by four streams of research, that projects that I've been involved in over the past 17 years. The longest of those research threads is in the yellow circle here. I have interviewed grandparents and their adult grandchildren, and then followed that with the second study, a larger study that interviewed 3 generations in the same family. So grandparents, parents, and adult grandchildren. And then I've also engaged in some focus groups. That's the Blue Grannies on the Net project. These were focus groups with grandmothers to discuss their experiences of technology and digital media, but with a specific focus on how these experiences are implicated in their relationships with their families, their friends, and in their leisure engagement. Then thirdly, I had the opportunity in the purple circle here to critically analyze various media representations of grandparenting. First, an analysis of parenting magazines from 1994 to 2014, where we did some content analysis of articles that spoke about grandparenting. And these are many of the examples that I'm going to share with you today. Second, with the ACT project, this year in aging was part of the Aging Communication Technologies grant at Concordia, where we tracked all of the articles related to aging in the Quebec media in 2017. And I then analyzed how the discourses of active aging, which I'll describe in a moment, were reflected in those articles. And last but not least, I've just finished a 5-year longitudinal study where we interviewed first-time mothers as they made the transition to motherhood. We focused on the intersections of leisure and public policy in that project, but I had a particular interest in terms of how grandparents are implicated in that process of the transition to motherhood. So all of these projects helped to inform my thinking as I was writing this chapter for this book. So moving to first into this ideology of the good mother or intensive mothering. So according to Hayes in 1996, she talked about these general points related to what intensive mothering looks like. And what's really important here is that mothering really is a historically constructed ideology. It's a gendered model that really, at its core, advises mothers to expend a tremendous amount of time, energy, and money, financial resources, in raising their children, devoting extensive amounts of time and resources to this. And I think it's really important as a critique here that this form of mothering is neither self-evidently natural, as it seems to be portrayed, nor in any absolute sense is it necessary. It is a social construction of what it means to be a mother. And it's quite contradictory culturally. So I'm left with some questions here about, well, when over half of mothers work outside the home, Why does our culture pressure women to dedicate so much of themselves to child rearing? It continues to be a very inequitable process. And I'm not generalizing, I'm not saying everybody has this experience, but very, very commonly so. And secondly, I question, in a society where this logic of self-interested gain, so positioning ourselves as rational actors who are supposed to maximize our own self-interest and material gain in a very modern society, this seems to guide behavior in so many spheres of our lives. But why then does this logic of unselfish nurturing kind of be forced to guide the behavior of mothers in particular? So that's just a short little overview around that ideology of the good mother. That then reminds us that it's important to kind of understand how we talk about aging in terms of grandparenting, and how that it impacts our perceptions of what it means to age. And so, in terms of some media representations here, you may have seen things like this over time, really focused on what we call the narrative of decline. So, a lot of emphasis on aging as a problem that needs to be solved. We see evidence here in the cartoon from the newspaper about the gray or silver tsunami, which is all these older people who are going to have negative impacts on social systems and structures like the healthcare system and pensions and whatnot. Despite the fact, the thing that's frustrating about these representations is, despite the fact that very prominent gerontological scholars like Ellen Gee and Gloria Gutman, they refer to this as apocalyptic demography. So it's the blaming of all social ills on a specific demographic phenomenon. So in this case, aging. So, just in summary here, I argue that this kind of language vilifies and dehumanizes older people, placing blame on the individual behaviors of these older adults for doing not enough to, quote unquote, stay healthy. So, this is a very problematic discourse that we're faced with on almost a daily basis. So that has led a lot of people to critique this. And you may have also heard of terms like productive aging or successful aging or healthy aging to describe how we should approach the study of and the experience of aging. So, related to some of these critiques, the World Health Organization issued a call for countries to promote a public policy of active aging, which you can see illustrated here on this slide. The reference is there at the bottom if you Google it if you're interested. Now, Stephen Katz, among others, critique active or healthy aging, however, for its connections to neoliberal and anti-welfarist policy agendas that emphasize control over aging as a personal responsibility, taking a narrow focus on specific health outcomes associated with aging. I also suggest that this approach has resulted in too much time focused on physical activity and physical health, and not nearly enough on social inclusion and well-being more broadly. Just a couple more quick examples around this idea of active aging. So this is one of many like it examples of Olga, who unfortunately, since the book has been published, she's now passed away, but Olga was a very active as you can see portrayed here, very physically active person. So this is one example where we see successful or healthy aging really valorized, okay? And while it may be very well meaning to present older people in a quote unquote positive light, it does stereotype them nonetheless, just the same, into a body that is idealized, physically fit and healthy. Okay. Now, should you, if you're not like Olga and out doing the Olympics every day, which makes me tired just reading about Olga, um, should you happen to develop any sort of age-related challenges, this is kind of how you're expected to behave. And this was one of the articles that we came across when we were doing that Year in Aging project of the media representations. And so, as an example here, TVA Sports described with great enthusiasm a recreational boxing program for people with Parkinson's disease in an article titled, importantly, Fighting Parkinson's One Punch at a Time. So the instructor from this boxing class is quoted here and frames chronic diseases like Parkinson's as a battle to be fought, pointing to the importance of staying physically active and not just sitting around the house. Okay, so here I suggest that by privileging this physical activity, we fail to account for the intersections of age, race, class, gender, and ability, and often ignore the varied family constellations and social structures and environments in which older adults are positioned. So that brings us to grandparenting. And very typically how we often see grandparenting represented in this kind of an image. One of the grandparenting as one of the few, now not the only, in my opinion, but one of the few positive social roles that have been afforded to older people in Western societies. Grandparenthood is often cited as a main motivator for active or healthy aging among older people in order to be able to support and spend time with their grandchildren. Now, in general, research around grandparenting is somewhat limited, both in scope and in depth. Uh, the experience of grandparenting, I think, is much more diverse and heterogeneous than the literature currently reflects, just like the experience of aging. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all approach. For example, it's important to note the cultural implications around the experience of grandparenting. So, according to Stats Canada, at 63 years of age, Indigenous grandparents are younger than the average grandparent in Canada. The proportion of grandparents in Canada sharing a home with at least one of their grandchildren is relatively small and has remained quite steady over time. But foreign-born grandparents were more likely, at 9%, to live with at least one grandchild in comparison to their Canadian-born counterparts at only 4%. 1 in 10 multi-generational households involve grandparents who are the sole caregivers, and an additional 22% represent grandparents living with a lone parent, the highest percentage recorded since comparable stats became available in 1931. And lastly, education is also implicated. So individuals age 45 and over who had less than a high school education were more likely to be grandparents in a shared home at 8%, compared with those with a university degree at only 2%. So that just highlights, I think, the intersectional nature of grandparenting. So it's certainly not a one size fits all experience. Despite that, much research has focused really on trying to come up with different typologies of grandparenting. And today's representations, and I just pulled a few images from Google here at the bottom. That's what you're seeing of this is very much how grandparenting is portrayed as this wonderful, happy, smiling, engaged relationship of generally a heterosexual couple, older couple with young children, right? And grandparenting is much more diverse than this. But what you do see a lot of is these representations, certainly being reflective primarily of the fun and supportive types of grandparenting that the researchers here have outlined. It's, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, you'll see some examples. You're supposed to be there, be supportive, but don't interfere, right? Don't overstep your bounds. That's what these normative discourses tell us. And so culture reflects intergenerationally transmitted values as well as internalized shared norms. So cultural values of individualism, familism, notions of grandparents as mentors for younger parents, as transmitters of cultural values and heritage, or as agents of socialization for grandchildren, are all implicated in the meaning making around leisure for grandparents. Now, little attention has been paid to the social and cultural norms surrounding grandparenting. Much research still draws on Newgarten and Weinstein's typologies that are from 1964. A more updated version came in 1985. They kind of pared this down in 1992 to three main types of remote, companionate, and involved grandparenting. Now, imbued though with Western colonial bias, this research also reflects a narrow conceptualization of what family is and reinforces family ideals that neglect the experiences of single, poor, and minority families. Only recently have researchers begun to attend to the gendered nature of grandparenting and how diversity related to race, class, and sexual orientation is implicated in grandparent-grandchild relations. I suggest that this research benefits from an understanding that the meaning of being a family member is both actively constructed and multidimensional. So, coming to some examples of this, what I've suggested as this ideology of intensive grandparenting, these are some of the things that we see from some of those parenting magazines. And thematically, I talk about this in terms of intergenerational ambivalence, where we have these coexisting simultaneous positive and negative experiences of intergenerational relationships. And I've highlighted in red here mostly because it makes my blood boil when I read quotes like this, but highlighted really the conflict that's emphasized here. So these are quotes out of parenting magazines targeted at the middle generation, right? But talking about grandparents and how this can be a time of significant tensions, conflict, and you see illustrated here some of the norms I'm going to come to in a minute around being intrusive. Okay, so these are some, and not the only, but quite to me shocking quotes around parents discussing what their own parents are as grandparents and seem to be quite disappointed about how those folks are behaving. Similarly here, if you do kind of take on this active aging approach and you're out doing your own thing as a grandparent, being active and having what they would call a productive leisure lifestyle, beating drums and sweat lodges, pursuing second careers. Again, these kind of quotes here are so harmful, I think, in thinking about what it means to be a grandparent. And down at the bottom here, you see the impetus here is like explain to your parents that you don't want them interfering or cramping your style. So it's all about here kind of how the grandparents really need to change their behavior, that they're not living up to these varied social norms. And one of those norms, now this is a quote from one of the focus groups I did with grandmothers talking about how they engage with digital media and technology in their family relationships. And this to me is exemplary of this norm of non-interference that those parenting magazines were just talking about previously. So you're, as a grandparent, you're expected to be involved, but don't interfere, right? Don't overstep your bounds. Don't take up too much of our time. Let us be our own nuclear family, do our thing. And so this grandmother here, as you can see, results in these kinds of behaviors where she talked about using Facebook and social media to post something on Facebook or to send a text message over a smartphone so that her son, she's talking about here, he could just look at it and he can reply when it's convenient for him, because she has very loudly and very clearly gotten the message that she's not supposed to be interfering in their lives. And that also, again, is illustrated here in one of the excerpts from the Today's Parent magazine, about reminding, don't slip into the role of the critic, don't nag, don't be a critic, those kinds of languages here. But what is really interesting to me here is this is not perceived as a problem that the middle generation, that the parents are supposed to deal with. The expectation is completely that the grandparents are the ones who should be altering their behaviors, their ideals, their ideas of what it means to be a grandparent. So you start to see really the intergenerational tensions that exist here. However, and this is not on the slide, but another quote that I'll read to you from one of these parenting magazines. But despite its share of growing pains, your relationship with your closest relatives is valuable, especially for your children. So read on for tips to help bridge the generational gap. Okay, so here you start to see that ideology of intensive mothering, right? It's really important for your child to have a good relationship with their family members, and in particular, the grandparents. So you see some very positive roles portrayed here: storytellers, family historians, unconditional love, passing on history and culture. So this idea of generativity, one of Erickson's developmental stages, which is kind of neither here nor there in terms of our conversation today, but what the impetus here is to be involved, right? It's important for grandparents to do these kinds of things. It's important to the family unit that we do these kinds of things. So this sort of summary table comes from Colleen Johnson, who really sort of outlined, based on these ideologies, this is the messages that come across for grandparents. You should be fun, be loving, be a good babysitter, give unconditional support. I hate the term babysitter when we talk about grandparenting, but nonetheless, You shouldn't spoil your grandchildren. You shouldn't try to bribe them, buy love with food or things like that. You shouldn't interfere. You shouldn't give too much advice. Definitely don't be disciplining the grandchildren. Don't overpower them. Don't nag. And certainly don't expect any reciprocity. It's all about what you are contributing to the grandchild, right? So that really extends this discourse of intensive parenting, or what it's like to be a good mother, and really prioritizing the needs of the child in this picture. So all that to say, this is my final slide, and then, but I do have a few things to say here, and then we'll open the floor for some questions and conversations. I think it's important here that Western cultures, as I've presented today, really seem to still adhere to this norm of non-interference, but also the norm of obligation, generativity, to be there and be supportive for your family. This results in considerable ambivalence in intergenerational relationships, as I've pointed out. So based on this empirical research and the media analysis, I question how this norm of being a quote unquote good grandparent is constructed. And I question how we can provide spaces for older adults to exercise agency in resisting these very normative prescriptions about how to be a grandparent. The prevailing intensive mothering ideology implores mothers to expend enormous amounts of time on their children. Tensions here with mothers in paid employment also often implicates grandparents in this neoliberal discourse. Grandparents are often expected to provide care for grandchildren and are censured by their children if they're unable to live up to the expectations imposed by this middle generation. One main challenge to this more active grandparent role is that parents act as the gatekeepers of contact with grandchildren and play a considerable role in regulating how grandparents should be involved with their grandchildren. These grandparents are expected to behave in very specific ways, often resulting in intergenerational tensions. Implicated in this tension is this intensive mothering ideology that shapes expectations of parents, particularly mothers, to sacrifice their own well-being for the well-being of their children. These parents subsequently extend these expectations to their own parents, who are now grandparents. Because most grandmothers today did not parent within this intensive mothering ideology that sort of emerged through the 80s and the 90s, this results in a clash of generational ideologies. Some grandmothers clearly resist these gendered ideologies, having come of age during second wave feminism in the 1960s. Parenting advice often reinforces this tension, as evidenced here in our conversation today. It also presumes that grandparents have the resources, the time, the physical and cognitive ability, finances, etc., to be able to provide this instrumental care and support for their grandchildren. So both consensus and conflict abound in this grandparent relationship. Generations are one basic unit of social reproduction and social change. They can provide stability over time, but also renewal and sometimes revolution. Expectations from both generations are too idealized, over-demanding, and unrealistic, thus merely compounding this problem. The institution of motherhood since the 1990s, The continued subordination of mothers and the practice of inauthentic mothering on which it is predicated give rise to what Kaplan calls mother blame. She suggests that the biggest reasons, this is a direct quote, the biggest reasons daughters are upset and angry with their mothers is that they've been taught to do so, end quote. So not that everyone is in conflict, but conflicts between grandmothers and mothers are reflective of yet another way that patriarchal society pits women against each other. By reinforcing this tension, these norms fail to account for the lack of state support for mothers, insufficient childcare, low wages, and the problems of sharing care duties with their partners. Never mind completely ignoring single family households, single parent households. This conflict transcends simply a class of generation and temperaments. The roots of these conflicts are not just personal, but equally are institutional and cultural. The grandmother's role is belittled by using language such as helping out or obligation or duty, when some grandmothers are providing 15 to 40 hours of care per week, very often unpaid. This is particularly problematic in lower earning segments of society where mothers can't afford private or state subsidized childcare and are forced to turn to grandparents, primarily grandmothers, for help. In addition, the correlation between short paid maternity leave and the popularity of grandparent care contributes to a more parent-like expectation for grandparents. Important intersectionally is to attend to the generational cleavage per se and the extent to which it masks the continued existence of the class cleavage between wealthy and poor. Lastly, I suggest that these norms fail to account for any agency among grandparents. Rather than existing as passive recipients with little control over the conditions that influence their identity development and their experience of family leisure, I see grandparents as agents in a continual process of negotiating and recreating their identities based on social practices and rituals of their everyday worlds. Intensive grandparenting, like intensive mothering, neglects this agency and the social systems in which older people are embedded. Unfortunately, this results in older people being routinely neglected or at best homogenized, resulting in both intrapersonal and intergenerational tensions around leisure engagement. So, thanks for bearing with me. That was a little bit longer than I anticipated. So if you're interested in any of the projects, here are some of the ways that you can access that. Let me just minimize that or unshare it as best I can and come back to folks to field any questions or comments or thoughts or reactions that you have to some of the work.